Welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast, addressing all aspects of the digital enterprise, inspiring connection without boundaries and creation without limits. Thank you for tuning in. Here are your hosts, Thom Singer and Craig Brown.
This is the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Thank you so much for tuning into this show. You know, we started this show to be a resource for those who work in and around PLM. The Digital Enterprise Society is a forum for the exchange of ideas surrounding the tools, processes, and practices used across the product lifecycle. To learn more, I want you to go visit digitalenterprisesociety.org. Now, my name is Thom Singer, and I have the honor to co-host this show every single week with Craig Brown. But every now and then, I don't have Craig here with me. I'm doing one of these career advice shows where I bring in an expert who's going to help you think more clearly about ways to advance your career. And today, we are joined by Dr. Janel Anderson. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about reverse engineering your career story. And that's really important because if you're up for the next promotion or you're thinking about, oh my gosh, time to go find a new job, being able to clearly and concisely tell that story of your career and position yourself as the expert that you are, that's more important now than at any time ever before. And Janel Anderson is an expert on this. So Janel, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Thom. It's great to be here.
I'm glad to have you. And it's going to be fun to talk about this because I love this whole idea of being able to clearly tell your career story. But for those of you who don't know Dr. Janel Anderson, she used to be a college professor. She taught organizational communication, which fits right in with what we're talking about today. And she is an expert in communication, leadership, and technology. And she travels the world teaching what she knows to companies and associations in technology and healthcare and other industries. And she is with us right now, right here on the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. So, Janel, I want to jump right into this idea of reverse engineering your career story. I know I think it's important, but why do you say this is super important for our listeners?
Well, most of us, Thom, have a career story that has a lot of twists and turns in it. And many times, some of the details, like getting down into the weeds, aren't really that relevant to the person that we're talking to. And so when we can reverse engineer our career story and think about it in relation to the audience that we're talking to, we can include the most relevant, the most compelling, the most exciting parts to really carry the story forward and keep the other person engaged. And then they learn what we most want them to learn about us.
So if somebody is looking for that promotion within the company that they're in, or they're going out looking for a new job, you know, they might be saying a career story. Thom, I've got a resume. Isn't that my career story?
Well, your resume certainly has many, if not most of the components of your career story in it, but it doesn't necessarily carry the listener through in the same way a narrative does. You know, when you think about a good movie or a good book or even a good TV show, it's got a real arc to the drama and it carries the viewer or the reader along. And we want your career story to feel like that to the listener so that they are just so engaged in you telling the story that they don't want to stop for anything. They want to hear how this all gets right up to the climax and right up to the point that we're at right now.
All right. But a lot of people listening are like, oh, no, I don't like going into the interview. It makes me nervous and they're going to ask me questions. And they aren't like someone who wants to jump in and be like, hey, let me tell you all about me. How do they even get themselves ready to go into an interview when they're going to have a story arc, as you put it?
Yeah, well, we're going to break this down. So I am a big fan of reverse engineering things. I've been reverse engineering things since I was a little kid. I used to reverse engineer what was the fastest way to get ready for school in the morning. And as an adult, I've reverse engineered recipes from dishes in my favorite restaurants in my kitchen at home. I'm a bit of a foodie, came in really handy during the pandemic, but I just always like to think of what are all the steps that go into something? And then how can we put that together in the most efficient, effective way possible? And so that's what we're going to do with your career story. So there's 4 steps to it. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think our audience perked up when you said reverse engineer. This is what the people who listen to this podcast get excited about. So I want to dive in. And my next question was going to be how, but you said there's 4 steps. So
yes, there's
let's
4
go.
steps.
What are the 4 steps?
Right. So the first step is to And I'm not going to share these right in order. This is the order in which you're going to think through them, and then we'll reassemble them in the correct order after I've shared each one of them. But the first one is you're going to think about what are the most dramatic or interesting moments in your career that have really moved your career forward. Now, this is going to vary if you're early in your career, because if you're early in your career, it might have been that first job out of college or even some specific college courses you took or influences from a particular professor. If you're later in your career, where maybe you've had a number of different positions with different companies, then you're going to think about which ones or which moments in time, which inflection points, if you will, were the ones that were the most compelling that really took your career to the next level, or really gave you the experience so that you could tackle that next promotion, or so that you could get the job that perhaps you're interviewing for, or maybe it's a promotion that you're interviewing for. So you want to distill what are those specific, dramatic, and interesting moments over the course of your career. Because we all know we have moments that would bore everybody to death in our career. So we want to filter some of those out and come up with the ones that move the story along the best.
Okay, so that's one of the steps, is figure out, what are those dramatic and interesting things? What are the other three?
Yes. Okay. Well, the one before that, when we put it all back together, is your launch story. What is the moment that launched you into this career? Now, it doesn't have to be specifically as broad as, like, again, for somebody who's a career veteran who's been doing this for a long time, we don't necessarily have to go back all the way to the moment where we decided to be a mechanical engineer or whatever it is we are. Instead, it might be what prompted us to want to apply for this company if we're moving from one company to another, or what's the launch story that led me to know that I have some talent in managing people if I'm a manager or want to be applying for a management position. So in fact, that launch story might look like something like, my colleague was out on maternity leave and I was asked to step in her place and managing people for the 3 months when she was out. And I realized that I had a knack for it. So that might be my launch story into launching me as a manager.
And we hear that a lot when we interview people who are the PLM experts that Craig and I interview every week here, is, many of people didn't plan to go into product lifecycle management. And so we often ask, how did you end up here? And so a lot of them have very different and very interesting stories of how they got into the PLM world. And so actually that, I'll now think of it as their launch story. So that's good. So what are the other two steps?
So the other two steps are thinking about the backstory. How much of your early career do you need to include to get us to that launch story? Because like you said, some of the folks in PLM have these long twisted career paths that got them into product lifecycle management. And so some of those pieces might be relevant and some of those pieces might not be relevant. And so as you think about the backstory, you want to pick and choose. And again, we're not necessarily being deceitful, but we're just picking and choosing the pieces that are the most compelling to the launch story that sets us up for whatever comes next in that conversation. So the backstory is the third part.
And the fourth, then, the last one.
The fourth and last one is the resolution. So how did we get right to here? So for example, if I am applying for a job and you are interviewing me, I need to have some resolution to those dramatic moments. That was the first part that we were cataloging. Some resolution to those dramatic moments. It might be why I'm leaving my previous company or previous position, or why I think I'm ready for this next challenge, or whatever it is that's bringing us right to this moment.
All right. So you said after we talk about the four, we're going to maneuver the order now. So let's give people some actual things that they can do to be able to create this story in the right order.
Excellent. So you've taken some notes on your own past, or just looked at your resume, maybe highlighted the most important parts of your resume or your LinkedIn profile. And now we're going to put it together with step one, the backstory. And again, just enough backstory to get us to the launch. So maybe you went to space camp as a kid, and that got your interest in mechanical engineering started. And so right from there, that might just be a sentence or two. It doesn't have to be every experience that you had that week at camp, just enough to get the audience hooked. So that backstory is step one, and it's going to hook them. Then we're going to go into step two, the launch story. And again, that's the launch story that's leading us more into leading us into those most exciting and dramatic career elements. And again, that's just a sentence or two. And now we're going to get into step 3. This is going to be the meaty part. This is where we're going to spend more like a paragraph or two talking about how each most dramatic or interesting moment pushed us forward into our career and really developed us to who we are now. And then we're going to get to step 4. We're going to kind of tie that together with a nice, neat bow, showing exactly how it makes sense for us to be in this interview or up for this promotion or whatever it is that we're doing right now.
So before somebody goes into that interview, either inside their company for a larger job, or if they're going outside their company looking for something new, how much time should they really be put into thinking through all of this idea of reverse engineering their career story so that when it comes their time to talk, they can really shine? What's a realistic amount of prep time? Because most people, I think, go, well, it's my story. I know my story. I mean, how much time do I have to prep? Sounds to me like you got to put in some serious thought.
Yes, you should put in some serious thought. And the way I recommend going about it is do that first part that I talked about, which ends up being step 3, those most dramatic and interesting moments. Jot those down first. Just spend a few minutes brainstorming. It doesn't have to be more than 5 or 10 minutes thinking about what those are. And then I would say leave it alone for a while. Leave it alone for a day or two or an hour or two. Go for a walk or do this over the weekend when you have some other activities planned that have nothing to do with this, because invariably the back quarters of your mind are going to go to work on it and additional ideas are going to pop to the surface. So I would say give that some time to percolate. And then I would say the same about the launch story and the backstory. Just spend just a couple minutes jotting down some ideas and then let them digest, let them marinate a bit and make sure those are the right ones. And then, of course, the resolution should be pretty clear to you. You probably know why you're applying for this promotion or why you're leaving one company and moving to the next. So that part is probably already there for you. And after you've let each of these things percolate for anywhere from a couple of hours to a couple of days, then I would come back to it. And I don't think you have to write it out in paragraph form, in sentence form, but I would bullet point it. Think about it as a product specification. We're going to bullet point the most important elements and then really lock those into memory so that when we're in that moment, when we're telling the story, it just flows naturally and we're very casual and extemporaneous about it rather than sounding like we're reading from a script.
Well, I definitely know from having coached a bunch of people on career advice stuff that some people do like to write it out because that's kind of the way their brain works. But I always am very clear with what you said. Don't memorize it like you're reading a script. Script it out so that you know where you're going, then throw the script away. Is that good if somebody wants to be a little bit more than just a bullet?
That is great advice for somebody who wants to write it all out.
Yeah, because I always tell people you've got to be true to yourself. And some people like to be very meticulous and go through everything. And that's awesome. But then you have to get comfortable enough with it where you can throw what you wrote away and go back to those bullets and just have a conversation. So when you're in that situation and you're telling your career story, you've reverse engineered it. How much is too much? I mean, some people are going to be like, well, in junior high, I got exposed to rockets. And then after that, I realized that aerospace engineering was my thing. And then I was in the military. And then I did this. And then I did this. And then I had my 21st birthday. And it's like, oh my gosh, you're 47. We're going to, how long are we going to be here? How much information is too much information for your career story?
Well, this is where I think you really need to think about who your audience is. So I've got one of those careers that twists and turns from a high-tech startup right out of college into becoming a college professor, then deciding I wanted to be an entrepreneur, but taking a detour through a large multinational corporation, and then eventually launching my own business. Now, if I was speaking to a group of entrepreneurs, I would start at the point at which I had the idea of starting my own business. On the other hand, if I was speaking to a group of faculty members at universities who maybe wanted to start a little side hustle and earn a little bit of workshop income on the side, I would start at the point that I decided to go to grad school. So I think it's very important to think about who you're talking to and what's the right starting point. And the right amount of backstory should just really be a minute or two. But I think it's so helpful to think about who am I talking to when determining where to start with that backstory so that, we're not going all the way back to junior high.
So What comes to mind is this is more having your career story and having reverse engineered it and knowing how to tell which groups of people kind of who you are and what you do so well. This is more than just if you're looking for a new job or you're up for a promotion. This is true if you're out networking. This is true if you're in a team meeting with your peers in your department. This is true if you're at a backyard barbecue. So how would you tell your story differently then to different types of audiences, maybe outside of that job advancement audience?
That's a great question. And I think we don't always know, especially if we're in one of those situations or settings like a backyard barbecue. We don't always know the background of the person that we're talking to. And so we don't always quite know how much to include or where to start. So I always think it's good to ask a couple of questions and to, so imagine this, maybe you're at your child's soccer game or that backyard barbecue, and somebody that you don't know really at all says to you, "So Janel, what do you do for a living?" Now, I'm going to say my very quick elevator pitch, but then I'm going to quick ask them a question or two about what they do if they have if they're working outside the home, because then that's going to position me better to tell them more of my career story and to determine which elements to add or subtract as I'm running through my brain, thinking about how I should position myself.
So you bring up the idea of the elevator pitch, right? I think that we've sort of overdone the elevator pitch in our society. I said it on an episode, I don't know, several months ago here on the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. I tell the story that, I think we need to throw away the elevator sometimes, because what we've done is we've taught people to memorize the same thing over and over and over every time they meet people. And for those of you listening who may not be familiar totally with the idea of the elevator pitch, it's taught a lot in corporate America and beyond. And the idea is if you got on the elevator with somebody on the 30th floor and you realized you could in some manner do business together, or they should know who you are, you flick this imaginary switch and recite a pre-memorized pitch about who you are and what you do so well. So for me, it might be like, "Oh, hey, my name's Thom Singer. I'm a speaker, a writer. I run an association. I host several podcasts, blah, blah, blah," just verbal vomit all over the person. But if you've just met that person, they don't care that much about you. They care much more about themselves. And so just rattling off something you've pre-memorized, to me, is a bad idea. And really what you're saying, Janel, is that have these things pre-memorized and then mix and match them based on who you're talking to. It's not just 5 sentences you tell everybody that you meet.
True. And I completely agree with you on the concept of the elevator pitch and how it's been so overdone. And I didn't necessarily mean to invoke the formal elevator pitch when I said that. And I like to think of, if you do have something akin to an elevator pitch, I like to have the bumper sticker slogan version of it, because that's more what I would like to use at my kid's soccer game or at a backyard barbecue. So if somebody were to ask me what I do, I might, in a setting like that, I might say, I help people play nice together at work, or I help people get promotions, or something like that, because that's going to invite them to say like, "Oh, tell me more about that. How do you do that?" And then I'll say, "Well, why don't you tell me what you do? Because then that way I can better share with you what I do to make it relevant for you." And so that's how asking the question of the other person gives you just enough information to help you discern which part of the backstory should I include, which part of, where I'm at right now and what I'm looking for next makes sense to include with this particular person or audience.
So as someone who has an expert, you were a college professor in organizational communication, and as someone who travels around the world teaching people, how to communicate better, how to get promoted, as you said, etc. What are some of the big mistakes that people make in business communications when they're talking about themselves, either inside the company or beyond?
I think you nailed it earlier when you went all the way back to junior high. And some of the experiences that might be the most formative to us are completely boring to somebody else. And so unless there was, maybe there was a specific teacher in junior high who really lit you up to science and engineering, well, then maybe it does make sense to go back to junior high. Or maybe you find out that the person that you're talking to at that backyard barbecue is a 7th grade science teacher. Well, then by all means, it makes sense to include that. But if you are applying for a new job or a promotion and you're talking about your 7th grade science experiments, no. We don't want to hear about those. So again, I would say bringing the focus back to what are some of those most dramatic and compelling moments that moved your career forward. Those are the key pieces to focus on. And don't get too down in the weeds, even on those.
All right, as we wrap this up, what other advice do you have for our listeners about how they can tell their story?
I would invite them to practice. Practice telling their story to someone who is a somewhat disinterested third party. So maybe not your spouse or your best friend, because your spouse or your best friend is probably going to give you advice that doesn't come from the place of, they're giving you great advice because they love you and they care about you, but they're not necessarily giving you advice with that professional edge to it. So maybe ask a career friend that you've had for a long time, or if you've got a career mentor, you might ask them. Maybe it's somebody that you used to work with a number of years ago at a different organization and you've just kept in touch with. That would be a good person, somebody that you trust and somebody that you're going to respect their feedback. And also tell them how you want them to listen. So tell them, listen as if you were the hiring manager and I was in an interview, or listen as if you were at a backyard barbecue with me and you didn't know what I did. So tell them how you want to listen, and then also ask for some specific feedback, but practice. That's what I would say.
And is this something that you can practice by just, maybe recording yourself, maybe turning on the video recorder, from your computer and just talking about yourself? Nobody else has to see it, right? Is that a good idea?
That's a great idea if you're comfortable with that. And if you're not comfortable with that, still turn that, log into a Teams meeting and don't turn your video on, or just use the audio recorder on your mobile phone, take an audio note, and then just play it back and listen to yourself. And I know many of your listeners are going to say, oh, but Tom, it's so painful to listen to myself. Oh, even for those of us who are professional speakers, it sometimes is the worst to listen to the sound of our own voice, but do it enough and you'll get past that.
Well, and that's one of the things I learned when I became a professional speaker. I've now given over 1,000 speeches in front of audiences over the last 15 years. But when I first started, I had some natural ability for it. But one of the things I did is I was given the advice through somebody in the National Speakers Association is every time you speak, even if it's just, I don't think 15 years ago I had a cell phone, but even if you just bring a little recorder and do it, they said, watch the video, watch how you move, listen to your voice. Do you say and ah? What do you do? And I watched probably the first 150 or 200 speeches I ever gave. When I got home, I would watch from my little, recorder or listen. And it helped me get over some of those verbal tics like and ah. I got a note from a listener of this show who said, you rarely have those types of verbal tics when you're speaking. Well, it's because I've done 1,000 podcasts, 1,000 speeches. Who knows how many times I've been interviewed. You get better if you pay attention. So I think it's good advice for the individual, even if it's painful. No one else has to know you did it. Record it and listen to how you tell the story.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I've done the same thing throughout my career.
So Janel, if somebody's listening to this and they're thinking, I need more of Dr. Janel Anderson, how do they find you?
Well, there's two places to go. You could go to janelanderson.com. That's Janel Anderson with an ON.com. And I also have a podcast myself where I talk about some of these same types of issues. The podcast is called Working Conversations. You can find that at workingconversations.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, Janel, thank you so much for joining us here on the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. I really appreciate you.
Thank you for inviting me, Tom. It was a pleasure.
Hey, everybody who's listening, every single week, we try to bring to this podcast interesting interviews and other ideas that are going to help all of our listeners enhance and grow their careers. We want you to join us here every single week because we're going to have lots of thoughts, ideas, and actionable information in and around your career in product lifecycle management. The Digital Enterprise Society is the place for the exchange of ideas around digital manufacturing tools. Go check us out at digitalenterprisesociety.org.
You've been listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Learn more about what you heard here today at digitalenterprisesociety.org. Join us again next week for more connection without boundaries and creation without limits.